morning, everyone. Consider with me, if you will, the word literature. Until I read the words of my guest, Annick Smith, I thought literature meant the literary classics, and it does. But the word also means the writings of a particular time or place, which is what Annick has helped to gather here in this tome, the literature of Montana.
We never thought it would be of much interest beyond the state, and so we only printed a few thousand copies. And much to our amazement, it just sold out, and they had to do a reprint right away. And from then on, it sold maybe, at least over 40,000 hardbacks, I've heard, and a lot of paperbacks as well. But of course, Bill and I and none of the editorial board get any royalties because it was all, a non-profit thing. It was supposed to be our gift to the state.
Yeah, a labor of love from Montana,
yeah,
and it's interesting that did it propel this interest in Montana, or did it coincide with the interest in Montana?
Oh, people approach me in the street and say, "It's your fault." Heck, it is. I mean, I don't think the book would have taken off the way it did if there wasn't interest in the first place. And so you get the circular situation, but I think there's a lot of interest in Montana and in the West. Starting in the late 80s, and this book kind of fueled that perhaps, or satisfied some of that interest, but I don't think it created the interest.
How did you go about collecting and choosing those pieces for your contribution to the book?
Well, for one thing, we all kind of got together at a whole series of meetings over several years, and started with this, everyone named all the pieces of Montana writing that they thought were really good. And I mean, we had thousands and thousands of pieces. And then we divided them up into chapters that one editor took primary responsibility for, but it wasn't complete responsibility for. And so then out of this huge list that everyone worked to put together, then I culled through that and chose out the things that I thought were like, my top 40 or something like that. Much of it was journal writing, diaries, some of it is unpublished history, some of it is oral history, and then a lot of books some of them were out of print, some of them are still in print, but they were Indians' voices, they were women's voices, they were cowboy voices, they were minor voices, there were all these wonderful voices that we were able to latch onto, and our two words that were sort of the key words in making a selection was it had to be vivid and compelling.
Good morning, Montana. In my humble estimation, 1988 was a notable year for our state, and not just because I landed here in that year. No, I'm thinking of the fires that burned in '88 and of the publication of this book, The Last Best Place, a book that celebrates 100 years of living in Montana.
We thought it would be history buffs would like it, Western lit buffs would like it, Montanans would like it, but we didn't think people in New York would be particularly interested. And it turns out it's a good enough book, and it was an unusual enough book, and it was a beautiful, thing in itself, and so strange, big, heavy, people kept saying, well, we love your book, but we can't read it in bed.
That is a difficulty.
It's crushing us. So we were very, very delighted that it got the reception that it did, because it was not put together to be, a mass popular thing. We picked the things that we loved the most, all of us editors, and that's how it came to be, things that we thought were the best.
Well, then what do you think, if I can ask such a simple question, its contribution has been then, if it's finding such a connection in a mass, variety of readers?
Well, I think its contribution, I don't know if I can put my finger on it, but I think it really made people aware that there was this very high quality, very interesting kind of storytelling that had been going on in this place and was related to this place over a long period of time, starting with Native American oral storytelling all the way up through the most contemporary, Debra Earling. There was a kind of continuity of storytelling that went through hundreds of years. And this, I think, there was movements from one kind of thing to another kind of thing, as the West kept changing and people kept changing with it. And I think this was very fascinating. And also, I think there are voices in there that are very kind of ordinary people's voices, speaking quite directly but eloquently about experience which had nothing to do with the Wild West, most of it. Had nothing to do with what we call the Western. It had to do with real experiences. And that's always touching to people. People read, and of course, what they love about reading a story that touches them is that they see somehow their own life, their own history reflected in what they're reading. And so there were enough kinds of reflections of this sort in The Last Best Place that it touched a great many people.
Good morning, everyone. Come spring of '95, look for a book of personal essays called Went to Montana from my guest this week, writer and filmmaker Annick Smith. Annick has called Montana home since 1964 when she first arrived with her husband and their poet friend, Dick Hugo.
Kicking the Loose Gravel Home, which is a film portrait of Dick Hugo, has its roots in an earlier film, which was called The Lady in Kicking Horse Reservoir, that Dave and I did the first 2 years we were here. And Dick was our friend, and we thought he was a fantastic poet. And Dick, you know, was wandering around through the state discovering things and naming them in his poems. And we thought, what a wonderful movie this would be, this great guy with this very charismatic personality, and these poems that are attached to places. And so we just got little pieces of black and white film ends and so on, and bought a little Bolex camera, and we started to shoot this black and white film. And then, and it was all voiceover. There was no live sound because we couldn't afford that kind of equipment. Then Dave died, and I came back to the project later with Beth Ferris, and we got a cinematographer, and we did Kicking the Loose Gravel Home, which includes pieces of that older film. But well, the older film was done when Dick was first here, when he was really drinking very heavily and not married, having all kinds of rocky love affairs, and just beginning to get known. 10 years later, when we did Kicking the Loose Gravel Home, he was an established poet. He was married, he had a family, he had quit drinking. There was a whole different sort of Dick there, and so the film Kicking the Loose Gravel Home includes both those aspects of it. And so it was a very wonderful thing for me. I'd been in Spokane for 2 years working on some documentaries about Native Americans, and I was a widow, and it was so great to come back to Montana and work on a film about a friend and just start wandering around, you know, going to Augusta and Choteau and up on the reservation, and we had a great time.
Say no to yourself. The old man, 20 when the jail was built, still laughs, although his lips collapse. Someday soon, he says, I'll go to sleep and not wake up. You tell him no, you're talking to yourself. The car that brought you here still runs. The money you buy lunch with, no matter where it's mined, is silver. And the girl who serves you food is slender, and her red hair lights the wall.
Good morning, Montana. Though today we know a lot more about the lives of early Western women, back in the 1970s that wasn't the case. According to my guest today, which is why Annick Smith started work on what would eventually produce the award-winning feature film Heartland.
Eleanor Stewart's story was the story of a widow who was kind of a heavy woman, and who married a marriage of convenience with a widowed homesteader, and you know, she went to work for him, and 6 weeks later they were married. And then she got pregnant and lost her child in the winter, and it was a tough story. But the character who we read about in the book that she wrote about her experiences was, you know, so full of energy and humor and vitality that, you know, that it was a wonderful combination of hardship and hope and joy and loss.
What do you think it brought to the film industry, to the viewers, to see this type of a film?
Well, I don't know. It was quite successful for the kind of little independent film that it was. But it didn't, you know, break any box office records, for sure. We never got rich. One thing that pleases me is that it was taught, and it's still being taught. My son went to Berkeley, and he took a film historical film class, and they showed Heartland. And so it was really nice to know that it's being shown not only on reruns on TV, but it's being taught in courses in Western history and women's history.
They call me Grandma Lando because I've delivered so many babies in this valley.
I'm pleased to meet you. I was beginning to believe I was the only woman in this country.
You are not.
Every white person in Montana has somewhere along the line been an immigrant to Montana, and many of the Native Americans as well. So it's a common experience. In my case, it's a double immigration because I was born in France, and my parents were Hungarians who emigrated to France, and then they came to the United States. And so I come from an immigrant family in the first place, and I'm actually first-generation American, although I grew up here since I was 8 years old. So then going west was, in the pattern of my experience, my family's experienced. I never realized I would be so taken with the net west, and that I would decide that this is the place I absolutely had to live and raise my family, and everything else could go, but I was going to stay here.
Good morning, everyone. If you're feeling these days like Montana is experiencing one of its infrequent land rushes, you're in good company. Longtime Montanan Annick Smith says the process has accelerated, and the best we can do is figure out how to accommodate the newcomers without spoiling what it is that draws them here.
Oh, it's not the literature that's doing it, for goodness sakes. No, it's because people are getting tired of living in really difficult conditions in urban areas.
Yeah, but if we were quiet, and if we were, we aren't the last best place. This is the last place you want to come to.
That's not true. It has nothing. We overestimate our own importance. The media thinks it's way too more important than it is. I mean, people are leaving LA because LA is really getting difficult to live in, and they're looking for places where they can feel safe, where there are mostly white people. They're looking for places where they can participate in some kind of an older American story that they will identify with. And Montana, Boise is grown as much as Missoula. Boise doesn't have anywhere of the kind of publicity that we have, but there have been, thousands and more people come to Boise than have come here. First, people went to Portland and Seattle. They didn't have movies, and it's because people are looking for good places to live. And then there's, on top of that, is that kind of romance of the West. And of course, having a few winters and springs like this one, a lot of those people might just pack up and leave. This is not what they bargained for.
Well, you really hit on it when you say in terms of maybe we overestimate our importance and our media's role in that, and myself too. You get immersed in there is that ethnocentricity, I think, if I'm using the word correctly, that, we are the center of the universe, and we do have something to boast about, but that's not why, these movies are being made or these books are being written. That is not the incentive to...
Well, people are making movies and writing books that are serious ones, we hope, out of some inner need to do that. That's the story they have to tell. Mary Clerman Blew writes her story because that's the story she has to tell. Mm-hmm. And I, get fascinated with a book about the Blackfoot, and it becomes very personal to me because I live on the Blackfoot, right? I mean, so a lot of other people connect with it, but I have this connection that's strong enough for me to devote 5 years of my life to doing something about it. Mm-hmm. I don't think you write books or make movies if you're serious out of some kind of, sort of romantic fad, or popular myth. You do it because it's what you're impelled to do.
Welcome to another edition of Montana This Morning with your host, Glenda Wallace. Good morning, Montana. I have some recommended reading for you. It's Mary Clerman Blew's memoir, All But the Waltz. Mary's my guest this week. She says writing about 5 generations of her family living in Fergus County, Montana, beginning in 1892, was a way of understanding her own life today.
one of the things that I discovered as I thought about the women in my family is that they had done many of the things that I've had to do. The idea of say, a commuter marriage where husband and wife live at distances apart for economic reasons is not new. And my grandmother had done that so that she could educate the children. Basically, she and her husband had talked it over, and they could see that they wouldn't have enough money for the children's education if they didn't get off the homestead and do something, and so they chose to live apart for most of the year, which was a little scandalous in Fergus County in the 1920s. And so I was interested in what that would be like. Lots of people face it today, but we feel as though we invented the idea.
But it seems to me it was so much, an nth degree, harder because of they were having to fight the weather. I mean, life was a lot tougher.
It was, and I think mitigated a little bit by the fact that their expectations were less. If they were, you know, if you're doing laundry in a wash tub and all the time looking forward to the 20th century and wishing it would get here so you could have an automatic washer, it would make it a lot tougher than it would if the washboard were what you took for granted. And so there is that.
But it took their toll on them. The way you describe your great-grandmother and grandfather, their faces dressed in stone.
Although part of that is the way the children look back and see that other generation. And we do tend, I think, to idealize our ancestors and make them out to be perhaps set in stone and much more dignified and perfect than they really were.
Telling the story of discovering your great-grandfather Abraham through his papers is a wonderful one, and the diligence it took to decipher and...
Yeah, it was fun to do, and disturbing to do, but also just compulsive. It was the strangest feeling to read those papers and know that nobody had read them for years, and maybe I was the first person ever to read them and speculate about the audience, why he had written them. And that sense of being in communion with somebody who had been dead for 50 years was just almost spooky.
Telling family stories, we all do it, usually at a family gathering, how Grandpa at the end there thought Grandma wanted to kill him. But suppose those stories were written down and published. Mary Clerman Blew knows about this because her third book is a memoir. I asked her what it takes to write so personally.
I guess the first step is through writing to find out what the story is. We've been taught that we have certain stories that explain the way we live. The Prairie Madonna and the Westward Movement and the gunfighter in the street and so forth are all part of the Western myth. They're not finally part of my story. My story is quite a different one. But when I don't have the myths to explain what that life was like, I have to find my own. I have to find a way to tell it. And in the process, it seems intimate, yes. But once I've told it, it transforms it in a curious way. The memories are no longer just my memories, and I don't remember them in the same way. It's as though somebody else wrote it. It's a story, and not just specifically my story.
What are the reactions you're getting from people from Fergus County, from your family members about the story?
Well,
stories.
A variety of reactions. My favorite cousin, Joe Murray, who still lives in central Montana, occasionally gets phone calls from people who want him to take them on a tour of this country, and he does it. He's a little puzzled by it, and he reports to me that everybody he knows who reads the book has some mistake or other that they point out.
Yeah. Well, that's what you make of the comment in your book about what memory is. How can I trust memory, which slips and wobbles and grinds its erratic furrows like a bald, tired truck fighting for traction on a wet gumbo road? You know, memory is so interesting like that.
Memory is treacherous, and I can be absolutely certain that I remember something in a certain way, and my mother or my sisters will say, "Oh no, it was that way," and it happens all the time. It happens to everybody. Students tell me that.
I find it interesting with families is when you do compare stories, it's like you get a whole new story by bringing the parts that they remember in.
That's right. That's right. And students worry about this. And what I tell them is that when you're writing memoir, and I think this is probably true of history itself, you can never be absolutely certain that you have the absolute accurate the story. Everybody's point of view is valid. Everybody has a story, and anybody in my family can tell the story in a different way.
If Mary Clerman Blew had followed her father's plans, she'd have returned from college to teach in Fergus County like generations of her family before her. Today she is a teacher, but she never returned home to the land that gave, in particular, her paternal grandmother, Edna, a chance at a different life.
The occupations of the people who homesteaded in Montana between 1910 and 1914 are just amazing. Doctors, lawyers, shopkeepers, concert pianists, all kinds of people came out here and thought they could farm and took up land, and my grandfather was an example. He didn't know a thing about farming. He had a hardware store, but he wanted the adventure of homesteading, and so did my grandmother. And when they got here, then it was up to them to, you know, figure out what to do next.
Now, which grandparents are you talking about?
Those were the Welches.
The Welches,
yeah,
okay.
Those were the Welches.
A.P. and Mary.
A.P. and Mary, yeah.
Yeah, very typically. And the story of Edna, I find, is that she chose not to.
That's right. She chose not to go home, and she could have gone home. And she said she stayed to save the ranch for my father, who was 2 years old when his father was killed. But what she apparently loved was the work. She loved to be outdoors, and she loved to work on the ranch. And she hated to be indoors.
And she bore the criticism of that a bit too.
That's right. That's right.
To choose the lifestyle that she did.
That's right. Yeah.
And I imagine that you have some sympathy with her?
I've got a lot of sympathy with her. I don't know that I would, in fact, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't choose that lifestyle. But I've got a lot of sympathy with somebody who knows what they want and sticks to it regardless of criticism or people who insist that the plot ought to work out differently. And it was unpredictable. For example, she was criticized for not being a good housekeeper. And, you know, what are you going to do? You're going to plow all day and come in and dust? And she didn't. She did the kind of work she wanted to do. But what I suspect is going on there with her was a kind of a feeling about the land itself. I think she did not look at the horizon and think how beautiful it was. I don't think that she talked to herself about mountain peaks and skies and clouds and colors and so forth. But I think there was that about the land that was almost as though it was her own body, and that she loved it and that she cared for it.
Mary and I will continue our conversation tomorrow. Mary Clerman Blew says she spent nearly a decade trying to write the story of her father's death. When she finally did, she was able to finish her remarkable memoir, All But the Waltz, which is a book that in part tells the story of strong Montana women and the men who left them too early.
It was true of my father, and of course we'll never know quite why he left. It was true of my husband, who also was a dreamer and who was really transformed by disease. And in so many ways, what I remember are old women who had survived their husbands, who were dealing with life in one way or another.
Working very hard.
Yeah, working hard, living with disappointment, as we all do, dealing with what life had to hand out and going on.
And reading your story makes me think that there are just 1,000 more stories out there.
Oh, I know there are.
Even today,
Yeah.
and each person who populated Montana in those years.
They surely do, and when I give readings, people will come up and they'll want to tell me those stories. Yeah.
And now you're telling a new part of your story with this new book.
Yeah. It's going to be out in May of '94.
Called Balsam Root?
Balsam Root.
Balsam
Yeah.
Root. Why'd you choose that title?
Well, that's hard to explain.
Read the book, huh?
Yeah, you really do have to read the book. Part of it is just as simple as that I like the sound of it. And the name was evocative to me for a variety of reasons. And it's got to do with a plant that blossoms again and again. It's a kind of weed and very common and very ordinary and just perhaps not admired in all places and not anybody's idea of great beauty. But still a plant that survives and marks the seasons and turns the hillsides yellow every year.
Yeah. And it makes me think of, again, the story of the women in your family.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what this will be about. Balls and Root is about my aunt, my favorite person in the whole world, who never married, never had children.
Imogene.
I am a Jean.
I'm a Jean.
I am a Jean, and in about 1990, she apparently suffered a stroke, and her mind began to fade. And she called me for help, and my daughters and I went and moved her to Idaho, and we tried to take care of her at home, and it got worse and worse. And so part of Balls and Root is what that's like, and what it did to me, and what it did to my daughters, and how, in a sense, losing her brought me closer to my daughters.
Flip through the anthology of Montana writing called The Last Best Place, and you'll find the name and writings of Mary Clerman Blew. She's a Montana native, born and raised in Lewistown, Montana, but who now teaches in Lewiston, Idaho. She says working on The Last Best Place meant the world to her.
It was like a wonderful graduate seminar in all the writing that was going on in Montana and the West. Well, in Idaho, we speak of ourselves as the next to the last best place, or some of us have lately. Everybody wants to live here, and it's got a certain glamour that Montana didn't have when I was a child growing up. And it just seems as though everybody I meet wants to move to Montana.
I do want to, again, switch gears fairly severely. Is at the end of the book, in your last chapter, All But the Waltz, you're referencing a time when you were involved with the Humanities Committee, and that's when you go to the...
to Bozeman, to Big Sky, yeah.
Knowing your story, knowing your ancestry and how hard it was for them to survive, and where you are today, it must be just amazing. How has the humanities kind of played its role for you in that?
Well, I went away to college, and the idea was that I would become a teacher, and that was, for me, it was my ticket to escape. And I just discovered the humanities and read and wrote, and that was just my life. That was what I wanted. And so I kept at it, and came back to Montana eventually and taught at Northern Montana College. And I was on the Montana Committee for the Humanities for several years, and its chair for a while. And since I've moved over to Idaho, now I'm chair of the Idaho Humanities Council. And one of the things I'm just really, really dedicated to is the notion of public programming, which the state humanities councils promote, of the humanities and the books that we read, and the stories that we tell as a way of understanding our lives.
It's National Arts and Humanities Month of October, I guess is why I'm kind of probing you a bit on the subject, the fact that you've given some of your life to this. It is important to you.
Yeah, it is very important to me. I just, and I think anybody who's taught poetry, for example, over a period of time starts seeing the whole world through this overlay of poems. A friend of mine can hardly go around Montana without quoting Richard Hugo.
Welcome to another edition of Montana This Morning with your host, Glenda Wallace. How many times have you been watching a television show and heard Montana mentioned? Maybe it was Billings or Missoula, but the reference usually made Montana sound like some remote and mystical place. Bill Bevis is an American literature professor who has been studying the region of the West that includes Montana.
The northern high plains ranching west, I think, has a lot of similarities from Nevada and Wyoming and Montana and parts of Idaho, though that has its own subcultures. And part of that history is that it's become quite settled and isolated. I mean, just as there's no single Montanan, or whether I'm a Montanan after 20 years here next fall, I mean, that to me is not a very interesting question, though it does arouse emotion sometimes. But the issue of who we are in relation to the rest of the nation is a strange one, because there's no single Montana in history either. That is, most the whites came in from outside, And they came in waves for the beaver, and then they left. Those first people in 1882, 3, 4, 5 were coming here to get rich quick off the cattle and the grass as soon as the buffalo had disappeared in 83. And they were really sort of mining the land. They weren't settling down. So that was a wave of people who didn't intend to be Montanans. When things sort of crashed in 1918, 1920 on the agrarian frontier, Montana sort of closed down and really almost dropped out of America. Our population remained very stable. We didn't get major industry. No cities arose. So from about 1920 to, what, 1980, Montana developed this, oh, well, I'm a Montanan, I was born here. You must be an outsider if you've come in 10 or 20 years ago, but that's only that part of Montana history. Now, in a way, we're returning to a pioneer phase. Whether we like it or not, Montana is going to be dominated, or rather, I can't even say that myself. Montana is going to be greatly influenced by people coming in from outside again.
Exactly.
With their own aspirations and value systems. And what I've always loved about Montanans is even though they may not have very much, they are very much. They have a very strong sense of identity, and they derive strength from that. And it does come from land, weather, region, history that's unique. The work I'm doing now is to see what's happening worldwide in terms of capitalism spreading certain kinds of advantages, but not answering questions of identity.
The West has been the stuff of legend since before the Lewis and Clark expedition. But according to my guest this week, American literature professor Bill Bevis, the real myth-making came between the 1900s and the 1940s with the dime store novel and Hollywood westerns. Finally, a Montana writer named Bud Guthrie had enough of the romantic West he was seeing. You know, you talk about the fact that he wrote The Big Sky to go against that sentimental myth of the West, and yet he creates another myth in itself, yes?
Yeah. Well, history goes on, and it's a famous topic right now among historians that we always are, that history is a kind of fiction. You know, the word in Greek, historia, does mean story. And Herodotus, when he said he was writing historia, meant he was making up narratives to try and understand the past, the invasion by Persia. So we are always remaking our own history in an attempt to understand who we are, where we came from, and that will never stop. And at the moment, we're doing major revisions of our history. Well, Bud Guthrie was a revisionist historian of 1940. And just as we will turn out to have uncovered some silliness and corrected it, but then committed some other silliness, Bud definitely was, as he said in an interview we did on KUFM back in the 70s, he said, well, I wanted to give the rough, tough, guts and blood aspect, not the heroic aspect of the old mountain man. And so he created a kind of unsympathetic man, Boone Caudill, for his story. Now, that was a realistic revision of history. But at the same time, Bud had his own romances and his own mythologies, just as we do now. And now when we look back on that book, or when he looked back on it before he died, doing his contemporary ecological work, he looked back on The Big Sky, much as I did. I talked to him about it. And saw its 1940s romance, and so on. That won't end. I'm also over 50 years old, so we're talking about universal human. I mean, you get to a certain point and you begin to resent the new. You begin to shut down and say, I would prefer the world stay as it was when I was in my prime. I think everyone does that. So Montana will change. I wouldn't mind our getting more tax base out of people working out of modems in their home and fly fishing. But this, of course, is, now I'm being Bud Guthrie, this is my own fantasy.
No doubt a good many of us feel that Montana is indeed the last best place. Now it seems it's no longer a secret, in part because Montana has become the home to some of the country's best writers. So when you came to Montana in 1974, you stayed in Dick Hugo's home. I think Dick Hugo is probably the consummate Montana writer in a lot of people's minds. What do you think is Dick Hugo's best work?
Oh, I think probably Degrees of Gray and Phillipsburg. There are a lot of good poems, but that's perhaps the most famous, and it's very, very good.
Do you think that people in Phillipsburg read it?
That poem's tough on Phillipsburg, and that's typical of Hugo poems because they present a town as quite depressed. And there was, there's some resentment up there. Actually, the way the conversation worked out was that the older people tended to have a chip on their shoulder about the poem's description of the town. You know, it opens, you might come here Sunday on a whim, say your life broke down, the last good kiss you had was years ago, you walk streets laid out by the insane. Not a pretty picture. Interestingly enough, the young people, the high school students, were saying, that's exactly what it's like here, and they were supporting it.
Talk about the writing that's happening now. We talked about Guthrie creating myths. Is the writing now creating myths about Montana?
We've gone through this, as you can imagine. Bill Kittredge and Jim Welch and Bill Lang, Mary Blew, Margaret Kingsley, all of us sitting around when we were editing The Last Best Place, Annick Smith, for years, 3 years of wonderful fun. We all knew we were doing this. Oh my God, this book's going to be so good, it's going to be nationally famous, and more people are going to move here.
Exactly with that title, The Last Best Place.
Yeah,
you want to come now.
Bill Lang said, well, what in the world will the title be? And we came up with various dull titles, you know, Montana Centennial Anthology. And there was a silence, and Bill Kittredge said, The Last Best Place. We said, what? What did you say? He said, The Last Best Place. Wasn't that like in Lincoln's Address or something? And then Lang, the historian, and Rich Rader said, oh yeah, he said America's the last best hope of mankind. And Bill, the writer, just, you know, the phrase rang for him, and he converted it in his mind to The Last Best Place. And we said, that's it. Well, of course, that's a nostalgic, romantic come on. It also happens to be a great title.
Oh, yes.
The Native American writers are just terrific now in the United States. And Erdrich and Welch and Silko and others are just terrific.
The call of the frontier, wide open space, that's what brought people to Montana in the 1800s. It's what's bringing them to Montana today. But according to Bill Bevis, there is no more frontier, at least in Montana.
When we talk in Montana writers, as you may remember, I can see the faces of 80 people sort of go, oh no, when I speak about water rights as the closing of the last frontier. Just 10 years ago, Norman Maclean in 1977 said the Blackfoot is God's river. But within 10 years of his writing that, we knew that every acre-foot of water in the Blackfoot River had to be allocated. If it isn't given out to irrigation or given out to this or that, it's given out for in-stream flow. Mm-hmm. Well, it's not God's river any longer. It belongs to the state fisheries and so on and so on. Mm-hmm. Legally speaking, that river is flowing at our will, not God's will. Mm-hmm. This is just one good little example of where I think if we were not making Montana famous through the literature, we would still have people moving in, would have pressure on it, but it might be an even worse pressure. At least most of the writers are writing for profounder values, I think, than sometimes our daily commercial world follows, and that's called the humanities.
And I'm quoting you here, you know, this idea of writers who've written about that it's all gone now. You say, something about the frontier, something about Boone's Paradise, something about Montana as we conceive it is doomed.
Well, the key word in there is as we conceive it is doomed. What I try and develop in the book, and most commentators agree on this now in history and literature, I don't think it's a maverick interpretation, that part of our past which says the perfect world was wilderness, as Guthrie says, without a man track on her. God, she was pretty once. God's country and not a man track on her, saving engines. Well, that idea that civilization is evil and destructive, and wilderness in a state of nature is perfect, and that therefore all civilization is an inevitable decline from the perfection of a paradise wilderness, that's a very dangerous view. And it's nonsense to most of the people on Earth, and it's nonsense to the Native Americans. Well, if they didn't destroy the wilderness by being Indians in it, why do we assume that we must destroy the wilderness by being white people in it? And it's not an inevitable decline.
The American Indian and the natives of Borneo, it might not appear they have much in common, but Bill Bevis, an American literature professor at the University of Montana, has traveled to that country and is now writing a book on what he found.
When I traveled to Borneo and the rainforest, Borneo is a huge island south of Vietnam in the South China Sea, in 1991 and 90 and 91, I was living with native activists who were opposing the logging of the rainforest. And I hadn't gone there thinking of parallels at all, but it was right there. The trees are the buffalo. And the natives have been living for thousands of years in the rainforest, getting everything they need from the oldest and richest rainforest on Earth, using the vines, using the trees for boats and for houses. There are no roads. I traveled upriver in dugout canoe with a 30-horsepower Yamaha on the back of it, and would travel 5-6 days above the nearest road or town upriver. And the natives were left alone, just like, say, the Sioux were given the Black Hills. Even after we drove them off of their regular grounds, they were given the Black Hills until we found gold in the Black Hills. And then suddenly we say, well, that doesn't belong to the Sioux. The prospectors and miners can go in there. The natives in Borneo were left alone until Japan said, we'll pay you money for those trees. And then in the last 10 years, the government and the Malaysian government in Sarawak, North Borneo, start saying, well, they're, quote, from the minister, there are no native land rights, unquote. And the trees belong to the state, and now the bulldozers are coming through, and all the trees are going to Tokyo to be milled into plywood, mainly for forms for concrete, which are burned after the second use. So what I'm saying is, as your resident Montana humanist, the things I learned here studying Native American literature, Native American history, and Montana history and literature, then I traveled to Borneo and found exactly what was going on in the 1880s in America is going on right now in the 1990s in many parts of the world, Brazil, or wherever you have a frontier of indigenous traditional peoples encountering that now it's no longer a European white colonialism. In this case, it's Malay. So we should be responsible citizens of the world. That's what I want our viewers to be.
Welcome to another edition of Montana This Morning with your host, Glenda Wallace. There's a quote about Missoula writer Bill Kittredge on his latest book, Hole in the Sky, that says, if there's a new literary West growing crazy, wild, and green and true right out of the old one, Bill Kittredge is it. Compared to him, the rest of us are pavement. And I look at the back of your book and all these great writers. You know, it's like, how did you get them to do this? Did you do this, or did your editor
I typed them
do
up
this?
and
made them sign it?
Yeah. I don't know. No, the editor just sends the book around to
It's
the
great.
manuscript
There's some
around to a
wonderful...
lot of people, and they respond however they choose to. And that's nice to hear. One of the things that's really nice in the West is that there is a community of writers, and they know each other. They hang out together to a certain degree. They exchange ideas. They're in touch with each other.
This idea that you can speak for the New West, you also speak for the Old West. How does that settle with you? Do you feel comfortable with those?
Oh, I don't know if I speak for the New West at all. I just have certain ideas of my own, and I don't believe anybody really speaks for the West or speaks you know, in any sense like that. I think that a society is in trouble as soon as it stops looking at itself and trying to see itself accurately and freshly, and I think it's the job of an artist to, I mean, all we're here for is to try to see freshly, try to help society see without blinders on. And not that we're necessarily going to do that right all the time, but we're at least working at it. And I think those kinds of insights that you put out, I think as society sees itself and evolves, which it always has to evolve and always has to change, I think each little individual contribution, it's like you're going to build a rock wall. every rock, I mean, rock by rock by rock is how you build it. And if I put in a rock and David Quammen puts in a rock and you put in a rock and Jerry Fitz puts in a rock, pretty soon, eventually, we have a rock wall, essentially. We have a new way of seeing and understanding where we are. And not just us, not just people sitting around, you know, paid scholars or writers or somebody like that. Also the people, you know, all over Montana who are contributing in various ways. They're having their say.
And what about The Last Best Place? It's sold about 50,000 copies so far. What has it done for Montana?
It was a good thing for writers in the West, a good thing for artists in the West, because people in New York suddenly got the idea that a book about Montana or a book about the West could sell copies. And it was, you know, it sold, the original printing sold, I think, mostly to Montanans. I remember a man driving up to a motel where I was in Billings after we'd signed books there about 11 o'clock at night with a pickup load of them, and he wanted them all signed. Fortunately, he brought a bottle of beverage.
Make it signing a little easier,
They signed books for a long time.
For a long time, the official story in the West was the Western, but now writers here are telling us new stories about ourselves.
And we began to realize there were lots of other stories to be told about the West. The West was really, you know, not a land of necessarily of heroes and radical individualism. It was also much more so a land of community, a land of family, and all those kinds of things where people got along together and made do with one another. And the West began to become much less of an intellectual colony, an emotional colony of somewhere else. The Western was a story written to be consumed not in the West, but in the East. And now we're writing stories for ourselves. We're writing stories for each other. We're examining the quality of our lives as we really know and understand it. That's a very different matter. And suddenly, there's a great upsurge of vitality, because that's never really been true until very, very recently, in the last 20 years or so. And as a consequence, people all over the world are interested in what's going on in the West right now, because we're undergoing, I think, in the West and in Montana, a time of enormous transition in which we're suffering all kinds of unrest and hate and discontent, and various parts of the population are being set against one another because they have different values, and what we have to really learn to do is to spend a lot of difficult time trying to figure out, you know, what the values and what the needs and what the desires are of all of our various populations, and we have a lot of different populations in Montana, and try to figure out some way to honor those without using up the place where we live at the same time. And it's not easy. We always imagine there ought to be some quick fix. That's another great Western and American, you know, the idea that you know. Embodied in the Western, perhaps. You know, if Shane goes down and shoots Jack Palance off the porch and everything's okay, we always figure there's going to be that kind of quick fix. There's not going to be that kind of quick fix in the West anymore, or in Montana. We're going to have to figure things out item by item by item by item through endless boring meetings and through endless, you know, negotiations and renegotiations and compromises, and it goes on and on with that. And it's boring to us all, and we all hate it. The paper's full of it every day, and we go, oh my God, I don't want to see any more of that stuff. But we don't have the liberty to ignore it. You have to learn to somehow find compromise and get along with each other rather than some kind of winner-take-all sort of situation.
Do we have any mythology that will let us...
I think, sure. It's done all over the world. It's what happens in our villages, in our towns, you know, in Missoula all the time. People are doing it.
Well-known Montana writer Bill Kittredge was once part owner of one of Oregon's biggest ranches. Bill looks back on this time in a bittersweet book called Hole in the Sky.
You know, in the 30s, in the late 30s, when we got a hold of that property, and my father and grandfather ditched all the sloughs and drained the sloughs and turned them into grain fields and got rid of it, you know, in other words, incessant desire to weed, an incessant desire to reorder, an incessant desire to make the water flow in more orderly manner. We all thought we were doing God's work. We thought we were straightening up the world. You know, we thought we were making things better. And I loved that work. I mean, what a passion it was. What a plaything those fields were. It was wonderful. It was a great ranch. It was, you know, farming was, I love farming. But as time went by, we began to see this, we began to get salinity in the fields, the water birds disappeared to a great extent. People go there now and they think there are a lot of birds. They should have seen it then, is all I can say. It's an enormous difference. all these kinds of things began to happen. And we drifted into agribusiness, really, and I lived in that until I was 35 or 6 years old. And only after getting off the ranch, really, and as I say, coming to Missoula in 1969 and beginning to look back and see some of the things that had happened and beginning to reflect on them, I began to see, along with a lot of other people, obviously, that a lot of the things we were doing were not good for the world. Right now, I think that property would probably be, it was almost bought by the Nature Conservancy last fall, and personally I wish it would have been. I don't think that raising crops on that land right now is the highest and best use of that land. And
needs to recover.
Needs to recover, and I think that one of the things that's wrong with the way it's being used is it's being used in the way that agribusiness uses things in huge patterns instead of honoring the kind of intricacy of what's there. There are parts of it, sure, farm it, fine. There are parts of it ought to be grazed. I mean, there's no reason why not. Maybe not as intensively as before. There are other parts that the cows should be off of. There are other parts that shouldn't be farmed. There are other parts that ought to be dedicated to wildlife. There's a whole intricate pattern. If the Conservancy had bought that land and a couple of other ranches that they were talking about buying, there would have been a huge enclave in that part of the world.
Well, our time's up for today, but join us tomorrow and Bill will explain why he feels this way. Today we continue with Bill Kittredge, a Montana writer who wishes the land he once ranched in Oregon would become part of a wildlife refuge connected to a vast tract of public and private lands.
The thing that I would have liked would have been that everybody then would have had to sit down and start figuring out how are we going to proceed, how are we going to get along with each other, how are we all going to make a living, how are we going to have enough money to support the schools in those little counties that don't have much in the way of population, all those kinds of problems, and at the same time not use the land in some sweeping way which is really destructive to at least a certain percentage of it. You can't keep just using things up and moving on, using things up and moving on. We have to settle and stay and take care of what we've got. And I think that's an idea that's gaining credence very rapidly. I think we're beginning to understand it in Montana a lot more than we did. I mean, a lot more than we did 20 years ago. When I came to Montana in 1969, I've told this story a lot. I remember Dale Burke ran a series of columns in the Missoulian about clerk hunting and the Bitterroot, and he used the word ecology. And I had to go to the dictionary and look it up. And I was a guy who read books. I was an autodidact, a book nut. I didn't know how to pronounce them, but I knew what they meant. And I think you'd be hard-pressed now to find anybody on the streets in western Montana, or in Montana in general, who doesn't know what ecology means. It's in the paper every day.
The concept that you have lived here since 1969, you've seen Montana change. Can you articulate what's good, what's bad about
Well, there's two things. I'm very hopeful in one sense that there's a kind of, there's been, from my point of view, terrific consciousness raising that's gone on since 1969. People are much more aware of ideas, they're much more aware of our predicaments, they're much more aware of possible solutions to environmental problems, social problems, all these kind of things that we were probably in 69. The other side of that, of course, of what's going on in Montana is that which I'm not so hopeful about, is the fact that it's very difficult to make a living here. It's very difficult for young people to stay here. And it's going to be more difficult when the traditional industries begin to fade away, logging and mining and certain kinds of agriculture. And what's happening is that we're becoming a place to move to, a retirement village. What happens then is that local people tend to end up in professions that don't pay very well, and they tend to end up in subservient roles. I wrote somewhere everybody's going to be a hunting guide or a motel maid, and that's not probably people's heart's desire.
When a rancher becomes a writer who writes a book about how we've misused the land, he can expect a few comments. Bill Kittredge is such a writer. How is your message about rethinking, the way we use the land going over in general?
Better than I thought. There's people in Warner Valley, I'm sure, who'd like to give me a shot right in the nose, And this kind of anger that is perfectly justifiable and perfectly understandable. Some guy like me teaching at a university is coming out saying, well, we've got to change the way we do business. And which doesn't mean we are going to change the way we do business. It just means that I happen to think that's true. And an increasing number of other people seem to think it's true. And I think that's the part of the humanities, that ideas play in our society. And I think if I'm going to make a living as a writer, if society is going to allow me to make a living as a writer, then I have certain responsibilities, which is to say the things I think as well as I can say them, and to send them out to society and see how they play. I don't have any illusion that I'm necessarily correct. I might be correct some of the time, and I'm probably wrong some of the time.
But you're contributing to the dialogue. And was that hard for you to write so personally and put yourself out there like that?
Well, a little bit. Anybody's a little apprehensive when you put yourself out there like that. But on the other hand, I think it's your responsibility to do so in certain kinds of ways. One of the problems in our society, I think, is that we don't say things enough. It's a very reticent society. It's a society that, and I discovered when I started writing this book, the society I grew up in was afraid of certain stories. Certain stories were not to be told. For some reason, they just disappeared. And the society reinvented itself in terms of other stories, which made it look better. And so these old stories need to be told. We can't keep stepping on what really happened. And that's what this book is about. Hole in the Sky is a book about changing lives. It's a book about not only my changing lives, trying to find a new life, trying to find a way to articulate my own life that seemed more satisfying to me, but it's also a book about changing lives in the West, a book about people trying to rethink their way into a new story of who they are, who they're supposed to be, how they're supposed to conduct themselves, all of that, which was what I did, and it seemed like a kind of paradigm story for the West, whether it is or isn't. And it seemed, as I said, it was my responsibility to tell that story.
To purchase a tape of this program, send $19.95 check or money order to the Montana Committee for the Humanities, P.O. Box 8036, Missoula, Montana 59807, or call 1-800-624-6001 and use your MasterCard. This series was brought to you by this station and the Montana Committee for the Humanities, a nonprofit statewide organization run by citizens to bring you the ideas and people found in the humanities. Welcome back to Montana This Morning at its regular time slot. Particularly a welcome back to those of you who lost us during the Olympics. My guest this week is David Long, a writer from Kalispell whose work has appeared in many places, including Montana's writing anthology, The Last Best Place, though it wasn't until recently that David fully recognized the honor of that.
There was Grace Stone Coates and Dale Ewenson and Mildred Walker and lots of others who were in Montana Margins. And I never would have run into their work, probably, if I hadn't have seen it there. And so, you know, the idea that somebody a long time from now will see a story of mine in The Last Best Place is a terribly gratifying thing.
Well, your work is in over a dozen anthologies now, though.
Yeah.
So...
Well, actually, for as few stories as I've actually written, I've been anthologized a lot, and I'm very happy about that, naturally. I think for a lot of people, they don't see where stories are printed. I mean, you know, if you have a story in the New Yorker, that's one thing, but most stories are printed in quarterlies or lesser-known magazines. And so the place where the story appears initially is not seen by most people. So really, you live in the anthologies. So there are these Western anthologies, or there's the, like the O. Henry Award stories or that sort of thing. And otherwise, you know, your stories just kind of disappear into the void. The publishing world has really become dominated by bottom-line type people. Mm-hmm. And a lot of houses have closed, a lot of them consolidated. People are not willing to take chances much anymore.
Is there a big market for short fiction?
Well, it's interesting. There was, the short story was extremely popular in the United States in the 20s and 30s. And there were a lot of magazines like the Saturday Evening Post and Collier's and American Mercury and lots of other ones that were paying people like Hemingway and Faulkner and lots of other people really good money to write short stories. And you could make a career that way. But after World War II, that suddenly became the time of the novel again. And you had these, a generation of people who'd come back from the war wanted to write these big novels. So the short story kind of languished for a while. And then in the 60s and 70s, there started to be this renaissance of the story. We had people like Ann Beatty and Ray Carver who proved that you could be a successful story writer. Donald Barthelme is another one. So there wasn't this pressure to write a novel. But now we've kind of gone past that again, and we're into the age of novels again. And people are very wary in the publishing world about publishing collections of stories.
Today I continue my conversation with David Long, a Kalispel writer who came to the Big Sky country in the early 70s because he wanted to study the art of writing, and the University of Montana offered one of the best programs in the country at a time before MFA programs were big. Today, David occasionally teaches a UM workshop.
One of the best things you get out of it is this, this group of good readers. And so when I'm teaching, I really try to encourage this group feeling. And, you know, I trust that a lot of what goes on is going to go on behind the scenes. You know, between classes, people will be, you know, drawing each other out and sharing their reading experiences and, you know, marking their stories up and all that.
Well, you hear such horror stories, I think, if you talk to anybody who knows anything about the creative writing programs across the country, about a writer walking into a classroom, submits his work, the instructor has it, the class has it, and then the instructor says, "This is trash, let's go on." Did you ever have that experience?
You know, I hear these horror stories about, like, the University of Iowa program, and there's an intense competition there. And, you know, I think the Missoula program has been really free of that. Mm-hmm. I haven't seen any of that, and I don't like it in my classes.
So you don't do it yourself, even though you might have a student that you feel like, you know, but the caliber isn't.
It's not my job to tell somebody not to write anymore. It's my job to try to find a way to make better work happen. So, you know, it's tricky. You have to find a way of saying what has to be said without stopping the flow of writing. Some people will stop because they don't have any talent. But I don't feel it's my job to tell them to stop. You know, I can tell them when it's not working. I'm very artifact-oriented. You know, I think that every piece of writing is a work of art. I mean, I'm not terribly interested in art as therapy or, you know, self-expression. Those elements are not very important to me. What's important is the idea of making an art object. So I stress the text and how it works and why it works and how it can work better and those things. I put a lot of distance between self and the art object.
Really? You don't think writing is an act of self-expression?
Well, I do. I mean, you're obviously putting everything you know into every decision you make as you write. But I don't know, it's just a way of looking at the process that seems to work for me. I like the act of making as opposed to the act of bearing my soul.
Have you ever read a story where when you were finished you weren't quite sure what the story was about, yet it left you with a strong feeling, like the feeling a good abstract painting can invoke? I think some of my guests, David Long's stories, are like that.
When I look at the process, I see that I was writing poetry and then I ran into Kittredge, and Kittredge's fiction is so lyrical that suddenly I could see a way of doing lyrical fiction. But the other thing that I got from Kittredge was this intense focus on having something happen in the stories. The stories I write are not terribly subtle in some ways. I mean, something really important has to be enacted in them. You have to get someplace. Kittredge used to say, you've got to take the trouble out and waltz it around the dance floor a couple times. So, you know, by the time the story's over, something has to have been decided. People have to have made their choices and have to have started to live with those decisions.
I think that that's true. I see that in both the pieces, Attraction and Perfection. Something definitely happens, but you're really not quite sure what it is on some level. I'm thinking of Attraction with the character with Cynthia and Marley, and at the end there. Both Attraction and Perfection, as a matter of fact, they both end with the women. They're both told from the female perspective, and they both kind of end with the women presenting some kind of ultimatum to the man in their life.
Yeah.
Is it interesting to write from a female perspective?
It's a lot of fun for me. I'm asked that frequently, and I'm not sure as I have a good answer to it, other than I think that women's lives are interesting, and I've lived with a woman for 25 years, and I've observed her life and her friends' lives and their dilemmas and choices they have to make, and I don't know, it's just a decision I made at some point that actually, I'm not even sure that I made the decision all at once, but I find myself drawn to each new story, and I find that often there's a female character that I want to focus on. As for ending the stories, you always, if you're a story writer, you have to decide where to cut it off, and you can play things all the way out, especially, you know, if you're a novelist, you have to, you know, say everything. You know, a novel's very full and everything gets fully dramatized. In a story, you get to cut things off a little earlier. You can more or less just suggest where it's going and then chop it, and you don't have to say it anymore. I try to figure out the point at which things have been decided and then kind of leave it there.
When you read somebody's collection of short fiction, it's hard not to notice the similarities in the stories. For example, in this book by my guest today, David Long, I noticed the character of an old man showing up. In his newer works, though it is in his old as well, I found there's an easy, random violence.
You know, Dick Hugo said that the good poets keep mining their own obsessions over and over again. And so as I've observed the things that I've been drawn to time and again, I realize that there are a few things. And one of them is that we survive a lot of randomness in our lives, that there are things that happen to us. I don't think you should have a lot of accident in fiction. I think that what happens to people ought to happen because of the choices that they make. But having said that, we do have accidental things occur to us in our lives, and we have to decide how to deal with them. So a number of my stories seem to have something happening to somebody, and then they have to figure out how to cope with it, how to go on from that point, and how to decide. For instance, in the Home Fire story, a man survives a truck accident that surely should have killed him, and yet it didn't, and he has to decide what to do with this stroke of good fortune. And he can either run away from his old life or go back to his old life, or, which is the point I discovered in writing the story, was that he had a third choice, which was he could go back to his old life and make it new, which is kind of a third possibility. So, I don't know, I don't think of my stories as being terribly violent. But
no, I don't, but there's just that element. I'm thinking of, I think it's Attraction, where Cynthia, the character of Cynthia, she's having an affair with an older man, and the daughter walks in, and I mean, in 5 words, her eye is poked out, and I mean, it's like, whoa.
And you know, I have no idea where that came from. That was actually a part of an earlier story. And this is one thing I don't think that non-writers really appreciate, because you see a story and it's already full-blown, and even though you know better, you think of it as always being in that shape. But That scene from Attraction was actually part of an earlier story called Blue Spruce. And that Blue Spruce got too sideways. And I know there was stuff in it that really didn't belong there, so I took it out and saved it. And I liked that scene. It took place in a roller rink. And I wanted to use it again, so I changed the names and let that be the first scene of a new story.
Attraction. That's the name of my guest's newest collection of fiction. It's not sold at the moment, but David Long is making a living as a writer who teaches, one who doesn't let the fact that he's won several fiction awards, including the O. Henry, get in the way of his job.
Somebody, I think it was John Gregory Dunn, said that writing is just laying pipe. You know, every day you lay a little more pipe. And, well, it's very important to get financial reward for what you do. Especially in our culture, where we tend not to value things unless we're paid for them. So the money is very nice, but also probably even more important than that was the symbolism. It is a kind of validation. I mean, I've been trying to get this award for years, and it finally happened, and I was very gratified.
Well, I think about the NEA has gotten a black eye, particularly from like the Mapplethorpe, from the more.
Well, it's really too bad because the critics focus on the 1/10 of 1% that might be objectionable to a few people, not realizing or not wanting the general public to know how much really wonderful work gets done by the NEA. When I was just out of graduate school, I worked for the Arts Council of Montana, and I traveled to like dozens and dozens of grade schools and high schools all over the state, doing a program called Writers in the Schools. And there were other components. They had jazz musicians, they had painters and sculptors and filmmakers and dancers and all that. And you know, this was funded by the National Endowment for the Arts, and nothing like that would have ever happened without some kind of sponsoring agency like that. And you know, that's multiplied all across the country, all kinds of projects that wouldn't have gotten to ordinary people in small towns. And so I'm a big fan of the endowment.
It's the same thing with the National Montana Committee for the Humanities, that they have their Scholar in the Schools program, the Speakers Bureau. I mean, they really are making a strong effort to get out in the more rural, you know, here in Missoula or Bozeman and university towns, you can have access to these kinds of things. So it's
well, I was out in, I was in a town called Peerless out in the east, and we had poets and writers in places like Flaxville and Circle and, you know, I can't even remember them all now, but I was in a number of one-room schoolhouses, and, you know, it was really educational for me.
Good morning, Montana. Today I'd like you to pull out your copy of The Last Best Place and turn to page 1019, Perma Red by Debra Earling. However, before we begin reading, I'd like to tell you something about the author, who today is a college professor, but at 17 was a high school dropout who came home to the Flathead Reservation with her mother so they both could get their GEDs.
I really wanted to work for my people, and I wanted to work for myself. I wanted to do something positive. I don't know. I thought that working in the public, like in the public domain, working as a public defender, working in the tribal court system, working in the government of my own tribe would be the best way to help myself and to help others. But I realized when I got there that I had so little education. I mean, I had hardly, next to nothing, and I was, sometimes I would go up against attorneys, and I had no ammunition, and so I just decided I was going to go back to school, and I was going to be a lawyer. That's what I really wanted to be. But when I got into school, something really funny happened. Jim Welch came to teach at the University of Washington, and it was a 210 class, introductory to fiction. And I thought, this is it. I'm going to take this class, and I'm going to write. I'd always wanted to write. It just didn't seem like a very practical thing to do. So I took this class, and in that class I wrote Perma Red, which was later published in The Last Best Place. And I remember coming home after its publication, and people that I had been adversarial with, people who I had been against, and people who had been against me, suddenly came up to me. And it wasn't for very long. It was only for maybe 5 minutes that they sat down with me and talked with me about the story and how it affected them and how, how they appreciated the story. So I started thinking that writing, for me, was really a powerful medicine, and something that I could do, and something that I hoped I could do well. I'm realizing the more that I write, how difficult it is to write, how difficult it is just to see those, to go through hard times, to write it. If you're writing about something that's really important to you, how hard it is to ride R-I-D-E out, write it out.
You'll find a couple of Montana's own in the spring '94 edition of Plowshares called Tribes. It's edited by Fool's Crow author James Welch, who wanted to explore what ties people together and how it feels to be kept apart, something Debra Earling understands, since like Welch, she is part Native American.
There's a story in Plowshares, the Dark Place, and it talks about that idea. For me, the story is about a story that I heard when I was a kid, and continue to hear now, about the old white man ghost who haunts the Dixon, who haunts Dixon, and he haunts the Jocko River, and about how he was murdered years ago by Indians who wanted to take all that he had. He had a beautiful white horse. And I thought about that, and it always bothered me, even when I was a child. I thought, there's something else here. These people were sort of locked on the land because of their poverty. They couldn't get out. And here comes a man who parades on this great white horse. And so I had to tell both sides of the story. And the story was an ugly one for me. And one when I wrote it when I was at Cornell, when I was finishing up my graduate work at Cornell. And one of my professors had said to me, "You're not telling the whole story. You're holding something back." And I said, oh no, this is the story. And he said, no. He said, look again. And when I looked again, it was like falling into a very bad place, that I had to work through myself and see my way through, that I had to reshape my vision, that I had to take a hard look at myself and how I see violence. I don't necessarily believe that there's an evilness in this world, but I do know that there's an evilness when we look in ourselves sometimes, and that we all have responsibilities, that we're not immune from the problems of this world, that we're not necessarily victims always, that we do have some responsibility to ourselves to protect ourselves in this world. And in this story, I had to look at that. I had to look at my own hand in things, the way in which I had stirred the pot myself.
I've had proof again that you can't judge a book by its cover. My guest this week is Debra Earling, a beautiful, soft-spoken woman who has a writing style as hard and as sharp as an arrow. Debra, who is part Flathead Indian, says she writes of what she knows.
You go back to the Flathead, and the Flathead is probably one of the most beautiful places in the world. I mean, I can't think of anything that has ever moved me as much as the land of my ancestors, the land that they were moved to from the Bitterroot. And when I see those, or when I go back to the reservation sometimes, and I've had the experience because I myself do not look, I've been told many times, oh, you look like a Suyapi, you look like a white person, you do not look Indian. And so I've had that experience where I can move between both worlds, partly as a bad ghost sometimes, I think, because I hear all the things that people want to tell me. I hear that, like in the story, it says that where they have their bad desires, and I hear that. I'm privy to that information. I hear the bad desires of non-Indians, and when I reveal to them that I myself am Indian, I either get this response, oh yeah, but you're not like those other Indians. Or I get this response, very much like the woman in the story, where they just kind of let you out of the car, or they stop talking to you, or suddenly you become a different thing to them. Your identity has changed, and changed dramatically. When we let forces from the outside tell us who we are and where we come from, what we should be proud of and what we should be ashamed of. All of those things that press in on us to in some ways take away our identity, to remove us from our source of power.
Which, to give you your credit, it was exactly what white people were doing in the late 1800s.
And continue to do so in many ways. And I don't mean this as like an evil source but many things that happen, many things that are happening now are to Indian people are bad. Well, they're bad. There's bad things happening.
A couple of years ago, I took a course from my guest this week, Debra Earling. It was called something like Native American Women's Narratives, and what we ended up doing was telling stories. I remember one of the first questions she asked the class is whether stories can belong to an individual.
I believe in the great power of stories, and that everyone, when you share a story with someone, in some ways it becomes their story, although they do not own it. They have their own vision of that story that is very individual, very unique. And in order for this world to move in the way that this world moves, and in order for this world to gain power, in order for people to gain power and authority, they have to understand that they are part of that whole storytelling process, that they hold their own story. That even in literature, when someone reads anyone else's work, they suddenly become part of that story that's been told to them. What's happened recently is that many people have moved to really own the story, to hold it in place and not let it, it's as if you dam it up. The stories are like a river, and people are beginning to try to dam them up, to hold them, to publish them as their own, to claim a name for themselves on stories that do not belong to them, and in fact do not belong to anyone. And I think I think that's a bad thing. I think it's a bad thing for Indian people, because what happens is people do not want to tell their stories when those stories are taken. And so when the stories are not told, the stories begin to die. When I tell, the story that I tell is never, I never write someone else's story down as they give it to me from their life's breath, from the story that they tell me. I hear many stories, and it kind of becomes, I guess, a conglomeration of all those stories. That always sounds so mixed up, but I guess in some ways it is. It becomes, I reinterpret the story. They are, and it is another story. But there are those stories that are told orally that are pretty much that there isn't any imagining to those stories. They're just kind of taken and then put in another story.
Though I believe it's true that a rose by any other name would still smell as sweet, I also believe the name you were given somehow shapes you. So I find full names fascinating, like my guest today, Debra Cecile Magpie Earling.
The name was my grandmother's name. Cecile Magpie was my grandmother's name, and I have since been given the name by my family, and it's my great-grandfather's name, which was Quatzkis, which means magpie cap. And he was a great and wonderful medicine man. He lived on the reservation maybe 80 years ago, and he was the wonderful thing, whenever I think of him, I always have this image of him, because I asked my mother, well, why was he called Magpie Cap? And she said, well, because he wore a cap of magpie feathers. And so whenever I have this great image of him, and sometimes in dreams I will see him, and I see this image of the feathers pressed to sky, and you know, I see him dancing, and he's very powerful to me, as all my ancestors are. But I think if there's a place probably where my stories come from, and I'm not sure why, I don't have any answer, or I don't have any direct reason to say this, but I think that he really is kind of the voice behind a lot of my stories. Whenever I come home from far away and I drive into the valley, and when I drive near Perma on Highway 200, and I see the magpie and the fan of its wings, there's something very soothing about that, just the black and the white, and it has that gentle coloring of blue that seems oddly healing and powerful.
Why don't you use magpie in your name then? Debra Earling, to me, quite frankly, doesn't even hint at your Native American roots.
That really is a good question. I don't know. I think a long time ago when I was talking to Jim Welch, I said, you know, should I use, you know, my middle name? And he said, no, I think it's really important that you just have, you know, a solid, simple name. And so I said, okay, I'll just present my name.
Welcome to another edition of Montana This Morning with your host, Glenda Wallace. Good morning, everyone. Today we meet Montana novelist James Welch, who's been nominated for a PBS documentary he completed last year with Eyes on the Prize filmmaker Paul Steckler. Welch says what ultimately drew him to the project was the desire to balance the story of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, until recently more popularly known as Custer's Last Stand.
It was a good project to be involved in, I think. A lot of the story is told from the Indian perspective, in other words, from down in the village looking up at the hills, whereas most of the previous work had been done from the hills, the vantage point of the white people looking down at the village. So,
right, I see. I remember the image of the big settlement, the Indian village that was down there. You mentioned that to make a balance, because history hasn't really balanced it, just in that image you're using of from the white perspective down.
Yes. Most historians have been reluctant to put much credence in the Indian point of view, because the several Indian accounts seem to vary. Some seem to contradict each other and so on. But most of the Indian accounts, the village was 3 miles long, and so the perspectives differed from wherever the person was in the village. So what we try to do is to put these perspectives together and come out with a credible view of the battle from the Indian point of view. And these accounts do make sense when you do that. And so they're as credible as the white points of view.
And now you've been nominated for an Emmy for this.
Yeah.
How's that make you feel?
Well, it's kind of strange, you know, because I have had nothing at all to do with filmmaking industry, and so it just seems kind of strange. I certainly hadn't expected this, but I knew that Paul and I had written a good script, a good tight script, which I think put the battle itself into a much larger perspective. And it got a great response. It got really good reviews, and it got a very wide range of viewers.
If someone wanted to view it themselves, is it at their local video store at this point?
No, they would have to go through the public's PBS catalog, which is called Signals. It's in there, but it's available.
Jim and I continue our conversation tomorrow, so join us then. My guest this week is Emmy-nominated writer James Welch, who's part Blackfeet, part Gros Ventre, and part Irish. Yet with that ancestry, he was still reluctant to write a documentary on one of the most famous American battles of the late 19th century.
Well, yeah, I was reluctant to do this because virtually all of my other work focuses on the Blackfeet or the Gros Ventre, Assiniboine Indians up in northern Montana. And I know what I'm talking about when I write about those people, because I've lived up there much of my life. And the Crows, the Cheyenne, and the Sioux were people that I knew a little bit about, but I never felt that I knew enough about them to write about them. So in some ways, having to do all the research and write this documentary film prepared me to write this book on a Little Bighorn and to write about these other Indians. So it really has broadened my perspective, my viewpoints on Indians.
And your book is called Killing Custer. How does that differ, or does it differ from the documentary?
I have more range in this book, and I deal more with individual accounts of either what happened at the battle, or individuals saying what they think of the battle in retrospect, you know, in terms of the current Indian condition. Also, I'm able to use a lot of contemporary stories because I thought that was important to try to understand how people think of the battle today. And how it affects their lives today. For instance, if you're a Crow Indian, what's it like to have the battlefield right on your reservation? How do they handle the attention that they get? Whereas the Crows were the scouts for Custer, and it was the Cheyenne, the Northern Cheyenne, and the Lakota people who were actually in the village. And now, in terms of the battlefield itself, the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne are kind of on the outside looking in because the Crow tribe is making quite a bit of money off the ambience around the battle.
Someone who's read a James Welch novel, and they're likely to tell you Fool's Crow is his best. The Missoula author says though readers find the spiritual aspects of the book appealing, he wanted Fool's Crow to be a hard look at Indian life in the 1870s.
And I think what people really are most interested in are the spirituality and dream aspects of the book, rather than the smallpox, rather than the massacre on the Marias, in which 173 men, women, and children were killed by soldiers who just fired thousands of rounds into their lodges at dawn. To me, this is the reality of Indian life.
Those are very good points, and it really brings to the end of the book, the very last words, and everything was as it should be, and I think, how could he say that? How could Jim Welch end the book that way? It's not.
Yeah, well, to them it is. They certainly don't know what's going to happen to them in the future. They know they've had this terrible winter in which a lot of people have died of smallpox and of the massacre. A lot of them lost relatives. But spring comes, it's a time of renewal. The first crack of thunder. They do the thunderpipe ceremony, which in itself is an act of renewal, an act of which sort of foreshadows abundance. The grass will grow, the berries will be thick, and above all, the buffalo will come back. And when the buffalo come back, that's the ultimate sign of renewal. That's the way they think. Of course, we know better. That things didn't get better for them, but I think the book ended on a positive note, and that all around things were as they should be. The buffalo were back, and it was a new season.
For them, the people who existed in that book, yes, but for us, the reader, that ending is so, heart-rending, because we know.
Yeah, that was one of the difficulties in writing that book, was that I knew that not only that I knew, writing the book, what happened to the Indian people, but every single reader who would read it would know what happened to the Indians. So to know what happened to them, it made it a little difficult to try to keep that tone of a positive life that the Blackfeet, the Pekuni people led.
In the first chapter of Montana writer James Welch's new book, Killing Custer, he compares the massacre at the Little Bighorn River with the one that's nearly been forgotten.
I try to put the Battle of the Little Bighorn into a perspective by comparing it in the first chapter with the massacre on the Marias. About the same number of people got killed. In one instance, the massacre on the Marias, it was the white soldiers massacring 173 Indian people. In the Battle of the Little Bighorn, 260 soldiers altogether got killed. So the battleground now of the Little Bighorn is a great tourist attraction. Hundreds of thousands of tourists come every year, including from Germany and France and Japan and everywhere, all over the world. And until I and some friends found the massacre site 7 or 8 years ago, it had been lost for many, many, many years. And today there is no marker there. There's nothing there.
But it was Native Americans that were killed.
Yes.
That's the difference.
That's the difference. And that's the basic difference. The bottom line was extermination, and many people, Congress people, officials, government officials, military officials, Sherman, Sheridan, lots of people said that if they won't go to quietly, then they must be eliminated, even to the point of extermination.
Mm-hmm. The question I want to ask is do you see, Native American culture seems to me to be having a resurgence. Do you see that happening, or did it ever leave that?
Well, I think the Indian culture has had a resurgence since the hippies in the 60s. The hippies were very much interested in Indian spirituality and tried to incorporate it in their own lives, and it kind of goes up and down. Lots of groups are interested in Indian spirituality. In fact, the latest group is the New Age group. But it's always Indian spirituality. They don't particularly, they don't have any sense of the reality of Indian life. These surges of interest in Indians come and go, but nothing ever changes the reality of Indian life.
After my guest today, Montana native Jim Welch finished his first 2 novels, both of which deal with life on and off the reservation, his friends asked that he not write another sad book. The Indian Lawyer is what happened next.
I could sympathize that, these are about kind of derelict young men who are trying to find themselves and find their culture behind them. So in this book, I did want to write about a successful Indian who is successful by anybody's standards. I just made him as successful as you could possibly get. And then once you build that kind of a person, I think a novelist's natural tendency is to sort of cut him off at the knees. He eventually decides not to run for Congress. He takes a sabbatical from his law firm in Helena, goes to work on an Indian reservation in North Dakota, doing a water rights case for them. And that's basically the end of the book. He sort of has left this highly successful, highly visible life and is working quietly on an Indian reservation. Which is not a defeat by any means, because a water rights case is very big. But he's just less visible, and he has time, I think, on the reservation to reassess his life, not only in terms of his career, but in terms of his culture. Because he's always felt a bit guilty for having left a lot of Indian friends behind.
I have to tell you this story. A friend of mine who I lent my book to, got done reading Indian Lawyer and thought she knew what you look like. Then she turned it over, saw the back, jacket. So the question almost is, are you in there? This tale of leaving the reservation and going someplace and being successful.
No, I never thought of myself as being any part of this character. Another question I always get, a lot of people know Indian lawyers, and I've gotten a lot of this from people saying, is this so-and-so who is an Indian lawyer, or is this so-and-so who's an Indian lawyer? And it isn't based on any Indian lawyer, and it's certainly not based on me. It's just a purely fictional account of person who has gained success, and what does success mean, I guess, is and this is a universal question. What does success mean?
Good morning, Montana. I'm on the road again, this time to Billings, where I met up with Cheyenne tribal elder Bill Tallbull, who's become the first Native American appointed to the President's Advisory Council of Historic Preservation. Here in Montana, Bill has made a career out of preserving the culture of his tribe, particularly when it comes to plant lore.
At that time, I began to research some of the things that I had not really understood well. Since the elders have gone, that were my teachers, I had to take it from there and go out in the hills and search for those plants that I had once been familiar with. And so I began to put the material together. And I contacted many people on the reservation that may have some knowledge of certain plants. And a lot of them retained the knowledge that was being lost. And so I gathered that. And they would show me a root that was used as medicine, but they had forgotten what the plant looked like. So I had to go out and into the hills, getting the location from them, and just start digging. And I would come up with the plant eventually. And for 2 years, there was one plant that eluded me. And I worked and worked and worked, and I finally found it in the backyard. During the time that I was a small child, I had lived with my grandmother and my grandfather after my father had passed away. And as a youngster, my grandmother would take us to the hills to search out certain medicines. And she specialized in treating of cancer. And so the first job that she would do was to go out into the hills. And we would go with her. We became her eyes. And she would describe the plant and where it grew. And so with that, I began to understand that you have to look at the plant. You have to identify it. And because of these plants, many of them look alike. Some of them are poison. Some of them are food plants. Some of them are medicinal plants.
Hello, Montana. This morning, I continue my discussion with Bill Bevis, a man who has many titles, but perhaps none as important as teacher at Dull Knife Memorial College in Lame Deer. It's in that role that Bill ensures we never forget the Cheyenne relationship to the plants that have healed his people for generations.
There was a protocol that took place during the time that they searched out a certain plant. The protocol included taking of a stem and leaving the root in the ground. If they took the stem, if they took the top part of the plant, they always took a branch and put it back in the ground. When you took something, you had to put something back. Well, the protocol also included talking to the plant and saying, I have come after you. You have given us many things. We have come after you, we need you badly. And then, once that happened, then we would take it. If it became necessary to take the root, then the protocol was different, because you were taking the whole plant. And this part, my grandmother played the old way of taking the root. She had a stick this long made out of green ash. And it was cut around at the top so that when she knelt down, she would put her hand on the top part and use her weight to press the stick into the ground. These digging sticks, there was two of them. One was 7 foot long, made out of choke cherry. And the point was hardened over a fire. And these sticks were used to do the protocol, the ceremony that they carried out when they went after a plant. Taking the root, they would make 4 motions to the ground where the plant stood. And on the 5th motion, they would start digging. They would dig a little bit with the longer stick. And then later on, they would take the short one and really go after it on their hands and knees. These things began to make sense after I grew up, that here was a way that we went after the medicine plants.
If you're interested in alternative medicine, take note of my guest this week, Bill Bevis, who has compiled a study of the more than 100 native plants used by his tribe, the Northern Cheyenne. Though not widely available, Bill says the information is readily shared, particularly at Indian gatherings around the country.
We exchange information about some of these, because some of these plants don't grow where they live. And so there's an exchange of plants. Maybe I'll get a call from someone and they say, we don't have this here. Do you have some of it? And so during the summer, we're always, I have one room in my house where I hang a lot of these plants to dry. And then I take them and I send them. And it's all free. It's I don't charge to do this because we normally don't. We just give them to somebody that can use them. I realized at that time there need to be someone that would gather all of these things that are very rare, the different types of bird feathers that are used in ceremonies, the different parts of animal parts that are used in ceremonies. Because when it comes to that time, a lot of these people that include in the ceremonies are always looking for those last-minute type things. And you cannot substitute an item. See, the rituals have remained the same throughout the generations because the rituals are exacting, and they are in sequence, and there's no substitutions.
And for them to be most potent, they need to be used in this tradition.
And so if you are out of sequence, then someone is going to remind you this is out of sequence. For instance, if four songs were going to go with this ceremony, then each song has to be in sequence, and then the item that we use has to be the right one. You cannot substitute it. Now, there are times when we lose sequence. There are times when we lose the item. And it's very demoralizing in a ceremony when you come to that part where something is missing. So we strive to maintain the ritual as exacting as possible.
Hello, Montana. This morning, I'd like you to think about the bear. Did you know that most North American tribes associate the bear with healing? The Lakota say that a man who dreams of bear will be an expert in the use of medicine plants. The Cheyenne also believe in bear medicine, and my guest, Bill Bevis, knows where to find these and many other healing plants.
Many of these plants have lots of stories on how they were obtained. For instance, a long time ago, there was a man and a woman who were very happy. They had just gotten married, and they decided to go to the mountains away from everybody and start living by themselves. They did. The man was a good hunter, and his wife would take care of all the things that she needed to preserve for the winter. And they lived good out in the mountains by themselves, and they were happy. Well, one day the man made snowshoes. He decided to go out hunting in the wintertime. And one day he didn't return. So the young woman went looking and followed his tracks in the snow. And then she realized that there was snow had slid down a mountain and covered him. But she could not find him. So she moved back to her people. And then in the summertime, whenever they were in the area, she would go into the mountains to look for the remains of her husband. And she could never find him. Years would go by, and then she'd still go out and look. Well, one time she was there, and she was coming back down the mountain valley in the evening, and he heard her husband calling her. And she turned around and looked, and there was a blue glow surrounding a certain plant. And he said, "Here I am. Take me, and you go home and use me." So the plant that was identified was, we call it black medicine. It has a black root. And the plant has Novocaine. It deadens the pain. It's used for many things, especially toothache. You just hold it in your mouth. And so there are stories relating to how some of these plants came to the people.
Have you ever attended a powwow and found yourself admiring the beadwork on a pair of moccasins or leggings? My guest, Bill Bevis, knows the work of the Northern Cheyenne tribe, and he's collected examples from museums across the country. Today, he tells us the story behind one of these original designs.
There was a young woman who had begun to live as one of the quill work people. And she had a piece of buckskin, and she didn't know what she was going to put on it. But it was going to be attached to the medicine lodge, which was a hide teepee. And as she sat there in her teepee with a piece of buckskin, all of a sudden from the hole up here at the lodge, there came a ray of sunlight, and it rested on her buckskin. And this appeared on the buckskin. And so this was her pattern. And when she got through with this, her mother asked her, "Where'd you get this design?" She said, "The stars gave it to me." So these became known as stars. And they were attached to the ceremonial lodge. There was 4 of them. So in order to retain the designs that were with the ceremonial items, always try to remain the same. And so this is what I tried to capture. And when I brought this book to the elders, I got the beadwork elders to come for several days. And we went over these to see if they would recognize them. And they did. They said, "I've seen this. There's a family down here who used to use it."
So the different designs are associated with different families in the tribe,
Yes.
as opposed to a tribal identity.
Right. If a family if grandfather had a pipe bag, and it had a design on it, naturally the mother would pass it on to her daughter. This is grandfather's. This is, and then another one would come and would adopt that. And so it became a community item eventually. They're all following the same pattern of this pipe bag.
To purchase a tape of this program, send $19.95 check or money order to the Montana Committee for the Humanities, P.O. Box 8036, Missoula, Montana 59807, or call 1-800-624-6001 and use your MasterCard. This series was brought to you by this station and the Montana Committee for the Humanities, a nonprofit statewide organization run by citizens to bring you the ideas and people found in the humanities.